Norodom Sihanouk was many things before history finished with him. A king at 23, a head of state who survived the Cold War by playing its two halves against each other, a filmmaker, a jazz composer, a man who could address the United Nations in French and then return to Phnom Penh and chair a cabinet meeting in Khmer before nightfall. By 1970, he had governed Cambodia in some form for 3 decades. He had done it carefully, imperfectly, and with a kind of theatrical flair that made Western diplomats nervous and his own people devoted. He had steered his country through the departure of the French, through the war in Vietnam that was consuming everything on Cambodia's eastern border, through the competing pressures of Beijing and Washington, both of which wanted Cambodia as a client, and neither of which trusted Sihanouk's insistence on neutrality. He spoke of Cambodia's neutrality not as a policy position but as a condition of survival. A small country between large interests had no margin for choosing sides. He had said this at the United Nations, in press conferences in Paris, in meetings with Zhou Enlai and with John Foster Dulles, who reportedly found him impossible to read. He maintained it through a combination of genuine diplomatic skill and a willingness to make himself personally present wherever Cambodia's future was being discussed. He was in Moscow when the coup happened. A Friday morning in March of 1970, and by the time the news reached him, General Lon Nol had already dissolved the National Assembly, suspended the constitution, and declared Cambodia a republic. The telephone lines to Phnom Penh went dead. Sihanouk was told, through intermediaries, that if he attempted to return, he would be arrested. If this story has your attention so far, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What followed was not simply the exile of a king. It was the beginning of a sequence of events that would consume Cambodia for the next 30 years, reduce its capital to a ghost city, empty its universities, kill somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million of its people, and leave the royal family as bystanders to a catastrophe they had neither caused nor could stop. To understand what happened to the royal house of Cambodia, you have to understand first what that house was and what it was not. It was not the Mughal court in its last years, a vestigial institution kept alive because its symbolic weight was useful to a foreign power. The Cambodian monarchy under Sihanouk was genuinely operational. It directed foreign policy. It commanded the loyalty of the rural population. It built schools and roads in the first years after independence. It was, by the measure of the 1960s, a functioning national project. What it was not was a dynasty in the conventional sense. The Cambodian throne did not pass automatically from father to son. The king was selected from among the eligible male descendants of 2 royal lines by a council of throne officials. This meant the monarchy's survival depended not on biology but on institutional continuity, on the council continuing to function, on the eligible candidates remaining alive, and on the political conditions that gave the institution meaning persisting long enough for the next generation to inherit anything worth inheriting. All 3 of those conditions were about to be destroyed at once. Lon Nol's coup in March of 1970 had American support, or at minimum American foreknowledge. The exact degree of Washington's involvement has never been fully established, but the timing was not coincidental. The Nixon administration had been frustrated for years by Sihanouk's neutrality, which allowed North Vietnamese forces to use Cambodian territory as a supply route. Within weeks of the coup, American and South Vietnamese forces crossed into Cambodia on what the administration called incursion operations. Lon Nol's government formally invited them. The war that Cambodia had managed to stay outside for most of the previous decade was now being fought on Cambodian soil. From Beijing, where Zhou Enlai had given him refuge and a radio microphone, Sihanouk did something that seemed at the time like desperation, and turned out to be one of the most consequential decisions in Cambodian history. He threw his support behind the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, had been a marginal insurgency for most of the 1960s, operating in the jungle, drawing from a peasant base that was poor and largely illiterate, led by men who had studied in Paris in the 1950s and returned with ideas about agrarian revolution that bore almost no relationship to Cambodia's actual conditions. Sihanouk despised them. He had spent years calling them the Khmer Rouge as a term of contempt and had allowed his security forces to hunt them. But from exile, facing a government he regarded as an American puppet, he announced that he was joining their resistance. His name and his face were what they needed. In the countryside, where millions of Cambodians revered the king as a semi-divine figure, the announcement that Sihanouk stood with the resistance brought recruits into the Khmer Rouge in numbers the organization had never seen. Between 1970 and 1975, the movement grew from a few thousand fighters to an army capable of taking a capital city. In April of 1975, they took it. Before examining what happened to the royal family in the years that followed, it is necessary to understand the scale of what Cambodia had been before any of this began. The kingdom the French had made a protectorate in 1863 was ancient. The ruins at Angkor, built between the 9th and 15th centuries, represent the largest pre-industrial urban complex in the world. A civilization that at its height in the 12th century had a population scholars estimate at around 1 million, supported by a sophisticated system of hydraulic engineering that managed the floodwaters of the Mekong Basin across hundreds of kilometers. The Khmer Empire at its peak controlled territory that included portions of present-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its rulers were god kings. The architecture of Angkor Wat encodes astronomical alignments and cosmological relationships that were the product of an intellectual tradition stretching back centuries. When the French arrived, this civilization had contracted and changed but had not vanished. The royal house that the protectorate formalized was continuous with the institution that had built Angkor. The French found that useful. They organized their administration around it. What Sihanouk inherited in 1941, when he was selected by the Throne Council at the age of 18 and crowned while still a student, was a living monarchy with deep roots in the country's conceptual order, not a decorative relic. That is what was at stake when the events of 1970 set in motion what came next. The fall of Phnom Penh on the 17th of April 1975 is one of the most documented and most poorly understood events in modern history. The city's population, swollen to nearly 2 million by refugees who had fled the bombing of the countryside, came out to greet the Khmer Rouge soldiers with genuine relief. The war was over. The bombing had stopped. The soldiers were young, many of them teenagers, dressed in black, carrying weapons too large for their frames. Within hours, the evacuation orders came. The city was to be emptied. Hospitals were cleared. Patients were carried out on gurneys. Doctors were told to leave their equipment and walk. The entire urban population of Cambodia, the professionals, the merchants, the civil servants, the teachers, the monks, the royal household staff, was pushed out of every city simultaneously and sent into the countryside to work the land. The Khmer Rouge called it Year Zero. History was being erased and restarted. The cities were dead weight. Education was counter-revolutionary. Currency was abolished. Eyeglasses were evidence of literacy and therefore of class enmity. The royal palace in Phnom Penh was sealed. Sihanouk returned to Cambodia in September of 1975, flown in from Beijing aboard a Chinese aircraft. He was given a ceremonial reception and installed in the royal palace under a form of house arrest so refined it was almost invisible. He held the title of head of state. He had no power. He could not leave the palace grounds without permission. His movements were monitored. The staff assigned to the palace by the Khmer Rouge were not palace staff. They were cadres. Their function was not service, but surveillance. The food brought to Sihanouk and Monique was adequate. The gardens were maintained. The form of royal life was preserved with the deliberateness of people who understand that the form is not the thing they need to destroy. It is only the content they want to control. The men who had used his name and face to build their army were now determining whether he would live or die, and the decision had not yet been made. He understood this. He later wrote that he kept a cyanide capsule during this period, given to him by a sympathetic Chinese official, which he carried because he considered it preferable to whatever the Khmer Rouge had planned for him. His wife, Monique, who would be with him through every displacement of the years to come, kept a diary during this period. Portions of it survive. The entries describe the sounds from outside the palace walls, sounds she does not name, but which the historical record names for her. The palace was in the center of a city that had been emptied. There were almost no civilians left in Phnom Penh by the end of 1975. The streets that had held 2 million people were quiet. What sounds there were came from military vehicles and from the work details that the Khmer Rouge had assigned to maintain the infrastructure of a capital city that no longer had a population to serve. Monique wrote about the birds. She wrote about the quality of the light in the garden. She wrote about what she and Sihanouk discussed in the evenings. She did not write about the sounds that came from beyond the walls on certain nights, because there are things that people in that position do not write down even in a private diary, because writing them down is itself a kind of act that carries consequences, and consequences were the one thing they could not afford. What was happening outside those walls was the destruction of a civilization. The Khmer Rouge's democratic Kampuchea killed through execution, starvation, forced labor, and the deliberate elimination of anyone associated with the previous order. The estimates produced by scholars who have spent decades analyzing the demographic data put the death toll between 1.5 and 2 million in a country whose total population in 1975 was approximately 7 to 8 million. The royal family was not exempt. Sihanouk had 14 children by various wives and companions, and the extended royal household numbered in the dozens. Several of his children and grandchildren were in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge took power. The record of what happened to them is incomplete in the way that records from this period are almost always incomplete, because the Khmer Rouge destroyed documentation deliberately, because survivors were scattered, and because many of those who witnessed the deaths did not survive themselves. What the record does show is this. At least 5 of Sihanouk's children and 14 of his grandchildren died under the Khmer Rouge. Some were executed, some died of starvation and forced labor in the countryside where they had been sent along with everyone else. The connection to the royal family was a liability, not a protection. The Khmer Rouge were not suppressing the monarchy in the way that a rival dynasty suppresses a predecessor. They were attempting to erase the concept of a social order in which a monarchy could exist. If this story is still with you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring more stories like this one. In January of 1979, Vietnamese forces crossed the Cambodian border in strength and reached Phnom Penh within 2 weeks. The Khmer Rouge fled into the jungle. The Vietnamese installed a government composed largely of Khmer Rouge defectors who had crossed into Vietnam in the previous years. The new state was called the People's Republic of Kampuchea. Sihanouk was evacuated by the Chinese before the Vietnamese arrived. He was flown out of Phnom Penh on the 6th of January 1979, the last foreign aircraft to leave before the city fell. He went to Beijing, then to New York, where he addressed the United Nations Security Council and called the Vietnamese intervention a violation of Cambodian sovereignty. He was, at this moment, arguing the same position as the United States and China, who were both opposed to Vietnamese influence in the region, which meant that the man who had allied with the Khmer Rouge to oppose the American-backed Lon Nol government was now receiving diplomatic support from Washington. The Cold War did not produce clean moral positions, it produced survival. The 1980s were a decade of frozen displacement for the Cambodian royal house. The Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh controlled the country. The Khmer Rouge, nominally allied with 2 non-communist resistance factions, including one loyal to Sihanouk, held territory along the Thai border and retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations through a diplomatic arrangement that many member states found repugnant, but supported anyway, because the alternative was legitimizing Vietnamese influence. Sihanouk moved between Beijing and Pyongyang, where Kim Il-sung had given him a villa. He negotiated, gave press conferences, maintained the fiction of the resistance coalition, and waited. The palace in Phnom Penh stood largely empty, guarded by soldiers of a government that did not recognize its significance. The royal regalia, the ceremonial objects that had accumulated over centuries of Khmer kingship, some of it was still there, some of it had been looted. The record of what survived and what did not is still being compiled. The peace process that ended Cambodia's civil war was the product of a decade of diplomacy that involved the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Japan, Australia, and the fractious collection of Cambodian factions themselves. It was brokered across multiple cities, Jakarta, Paris, New York, and required holding together a coalition of parties whose interests were deeply opposed on almost every substantive question except the narrowest possible shared goal, that the fighting should stop. The negotiations were extraordinary in their complexity and fragile in almost every particular. The Khmer Rouge, which remained an armed force throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, signed the accords and then progressively withdrew from compliance. The United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia deployed more than 20,000 military and civilian personnel to oversee the transition. The elections it organized in May of 1993 were conducted under conditions that included Khmer Rouge-sanctioned violence against electoral workers in the provinces the movement controlled. Voters came anyway. The turnout was over 90%. People who had survived a genocide stood in line in the heat to vote, because the act of voting was itself something the genocide had tried to make impossible. The peace process that ended Cambodia's civil war was long, complicated, and ultimately brokered by the United Nations in a framework known as the Paris Peace Accords, signed in October of 1991. The accords established a transitional authority, scheduled elections, and created the conditions for the monarchy's restoration. Sihanouk returned to Phnom Penh on the 14th of November 1991 to a reception that was not ceremonial so much as elemental. 1 million people in the streets of a city that had been emptied and refilled and emptied again, many of them weeping. He was 68 years old. He had been in exile for more than 20 years. The royal palace opened, the throne room was cleaned, the elections held in May of 1993 produced a result that the losing party, the Cambodian People's Party led by Hun Sen, refused to fully accept. A political compromise was negotiated. The monarchy was restored by Constitutional Assembly in September of 1993, and Norodom Sihanouk ascended the throne for the second time. What he ascended to was a constitutional monarchy in a country where the real power was divided between two prime ministers, one from the royalist party Hun Sen, led by his son Norodom Ranarid, and one from the Cambodian People's Party. The arrangement was inherently unstable. The country's institutions had been destroyed twice over, first by the Khmer Rouge, and then by 14 years of a government that was itself an improvisation. The judiciary did not function as an independent body. The military was a collection of competing factions that had been nominally unified but had not been integrated. Landmines covered an estimated 10% of the country's land. The economy operated largely on foreign aid. The royal family was back in the palace, but the palace was a symbol inside a country that had not yet decided what it was. The second prime minister arrangement collapsed in violence in July of 1997. Hun Sen's forces launched an assault on the military units loyal to Prince Ranarid, who fled the country. More than 40 of his political allies were executed. Sihanouk, who was in Beijing for medical treatment, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his second reign, issued statements and appeals and had no practical leverage over any of it. He returned to Cambodia after the fighting ended and continued to serve as a figure of national unity whose ability to unify had been tested to its practical limits. He abdicated in October of 2004, citing his age and his health. He was 81. The Throne Council met and selected his son, Norodom Sihanouk, a former ballet dancer and diplomat who had spent most of his adult life in Europe, to be the next king. Sihamoni was not a political figure. He had not been part of the resistance governments of the 1980s. He had not been present during the worst years. He had built a career as a cultural ambassador for Cambodia in France, and then as a UNESCO representative. He was, by temperament and by training, a ceremonial monarch in a country where that was now the only kind that the political structure permitted. Sihanouk went to Beijing again for medical treatment and did not return to Cambodia as a permanent resident. He died in Beijing on the 15th of October 2012 at the age of 89. His body was returned to Phnom Penh aboard a Chinese aircraft. The funeral ceremonies lasted several days and were attended by hundreds of thousands of people who lined the streets of the capital. He was cremated in a royal ceremony on the grounds of the palace. His ashes were placed in a stupa beside the silver pagoda. Inside the palace compound he had left so many times and returned to so many times across 60 years of the most violent political history of the 20th century. The accounting of what the royal family lost across those decades cannot be made in a single figure because what was lost was not primarily material. The material losses were real. The properties confiscated during the Khmer Rouge years, the ceremonial objects that disappeared and were never recovered, the family members who died in the countryside under conditions that the Cambodian Genocide Documentation Center has spent decades trying to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. The National Archives of Cambodia, which might have held some of the relevant records, was itself partially destroyed and scattered. What is documented is incomplete. What is incomplete is not therefore absent. The absence is itself a document, in the same way that a ledger that stops mid-page is a document of the moment someone decided it should stop. The deeper loss was structural. The royal family had survived as an institution because the Cambodian monarchy was not simply a political arrangement, but a cosmological one. The king, as the axis around which the kingdom's ritual order turned, the ceremonies of plowing and harvest and water that connected the throne to the agricultural cycles that most Cambodians lived within. The Khmer Rouge had not simply removed the king from the throne, they had attempted to destroy the entire conceptual architecture within which a throne could be meaningful. The monks were killed or dispersed. The temples were shuttered or used as storage facilities or converted to other purposes. The ceremonies stopped. The textual traditions that transmitted the ritual knowledge, the manuscripts held in temple libraries across the country, were largely destroyed. Scholars working in the 2 decades since peace was established have estimated that between 70 and 90% of Cambodia's traditional manuscripts did not survive the Khmer Rouge period. The librarians and monks and scholars who could read them were dead. The chain of transmission that connects a living institution to its own past was cut in dozens of places simultaneously. King Sihamoni has reigned since 2004 in the constitutional form that the 1993 settlement established. He does not govern. He presides. He opens sessions of parliament. He receives foreign dignitaries. He travels the country for ceremonies and visits. The Cambodian People's Party under Hun Sen governed Cambodia without effective political opposition for nearly 4 decades, until Hun Sen stepped down in 2023 and was succeeded by his son Hun Manet. The dynasty that replaced the monarchy as the operative center of Cambodian political power is not a royal house in any formal sense, but it functions with a dynastic logic that the country's institutional structure now accommodates without challenge. The royal palace still stands in Phnom Penh, white and gold beside the Mekong, its throne room intact, its ceremonial calendar observed. Tourists move through the silver pagoda and look at the emerald Buddha and the gold Buddha covered in diamonds and the mosaic floor of Italian tile. The objects are there. The institution that gave them meaning is present in the building but constrained in every direction that would give it weight. What survives of the royal family outside the palace is dispersed and difficult to catalogue. The extended royal household was never large in the way that some dynasties maintain large numbers of titled relatives. It was, after the Khmer Rouge years, smaller than it had been. The exact count of how much smaller is still subject to documentary uncertainty. The descendants of Sihanouk who survived live in Cambodia and abroad. None of them hold political office of consequence. Norodom Sihanouk, who had been first prime minister in the 1990s and later president of the National Assembly, died in a road accident in France in 2021. His political party, once the royalist standard-bearer, was dissolved by court order in 2017, along with other opposition parties, in a process that international observers described as the elimination of meaningful electoral competition. The palace in Phnom Penh holds the royal regalia that survived. The most significant objects, the sacred sword, the royal slippers, the fly whisk, the crown, were hidden during the Khmer Rouge period by palace officials who understood what would happen to them if they were found. Several of these officials died without revealing the hiding places. Others survived and led recovery efforts after 1979. The sword and the crown were recovered. Not everything was. The inventory of what was taken, what was destroyed, and what was hidden and never found is a document that the Royal Palace Museum has been compiling for decades and has not finished. There is a room in the palace that visitors do not enter. The records associated with it are not public. What the camera, if it could travel through the palace archives, would find there is not established in any document that has been made available. The absence of that document is noted. Sihanouk left behind an autobiography and a body of writing and filmmaking that runs to dozens of volumes and films. He wrote in French, with a directness about his own failures and calculations that is unusual in political memoir. He wrote about the decision to ally with the Khmer Rouge with something that reads less like regret than like a cold examination of a calculation that he knew at the time was dangerous and made anyway because the alternative seemed worse. He wrote about the children and grandchildren who died under the regime he had helped bring to power. He did not write about this in the language of guilt, because guilt was a private matter, and Sihanouk understood that what he was producing was a historical record, not a confession. The record shows what it shows. The silence around it shows what that shows. In the northeast of the country, in the provinces where the Khmer Rouge had their strongest roots, and where the evacuation columns were sent to work the fields, there are mass graves that have been mapped but not all excavated. The Documentation Center of Cambodia, established in the 1990s with support from international human rights organizations, has identified more than 20,000 sites. The number of individual grave locations within those sites is higher. Some of the graves contain the remains of people whose families are still alive and have never been told where their relatives are buried. Some contain the remains of people whose entire families are also in the graves. The royal family members who died in those years are among the unlocated. The record of where they were sent, under what names they were registered, most people used false names to hide their origins, and when they died is in most cases non-existent. They were erased not by a sealed archive but by the destruction of the archiving system itself. The structure still standing. The royal palace in Phnom Penh was built in the 1860s on the site of an older palace that had been the seat of the Khmer kings before the French protectorate reorganized the capital. The current buildings are a mix of French colonial and traditional Khmer architectural forms, built and rebuilt across the decades of the Protectorate and independence. They survived the Khmer Rouge period, which used portions of the compound for other purposes but did not demolish the main structures. They stand now as they stood before: the throne hall with its ceremonial architecture, the silver pagoda with its tiled floor and its Buddhas, the gardens with their carefully maintained grounds. The physical structures are intact, what they contained as living institutions: the court ceremonies, the ritual calendar, the trained personnel, the textual traditions, the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Much of that is reconstruction rather than survival. The monks who returned to the temples after 1979 learned their traditions from the few who had survived, or from texts that had been preserved outside Cambodia, in Thailand and France and the United States, in the libraries of monks who had been abroad when the Khmer Rouge took power. The knowledge came back across long distances and across the deaths of the people who had held it. It came back changed, inevitably, in the way that anything that has to be rebuilt from fragments is changed by the process of reconstruction. Sihanouk's ashes are in the stupa beside the silver pagoda. The stupa is visited. The palace ground is open on certain days to the public. Cambodians come to walk through the grounds and look at the throne hall from the outside, and buy photographs and light incense at the small shrines inside the compound. The tourists come in organized groups with guides who explain the history in several languages. The guide explains who built the throne hall and when, what the coronation ceremonies involve, how the royal regalia is stored and used. The guide explains the Khmer Rouge period in the clinical language of history, dates and death tolls in the Vietnamese intervention, and then moves the group on to the silver pagoda and the emerald Buddha. The stupa where the ashes are kept is a short walk from the pagoda. Most visitors stop there briefly. The inscription gives the dates. The gold leaf on the stupa is maintained. The man who abdicated twice and outlasted a genocide and addressed the United Nations Security Council and wrote films and composed music and kept a cyanide capsule in his pocket during house arrest in the palace he now rests beside. The inscription gives his name and his dates and nothing else, because the stone cannot hold what the record, taken whole, contains. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.